We have been wounded sorely, yet still we stand with fire in our hearts. Let them think us beaten. We will teach them otherwise. Thus spoke Pedro Cantor, chapter master of the Crimson Fists. Following the Battle of the Iron Cage and the breaking of the original Imperial Fist Legion, it was Rogel Dorn himself who appointed the first chapter master of the Crimson Fists, Captain Alexei Polu, a tactical genius and a physical giant amongst his brother Astartes. At least I assume you're supposed to pronounce his name the French way. It's spelled Alexis Pollux. I just assumed the extra consonants made him French, or Space French equivalent. Originally a fleet-based chapter, the Crimson Fists have fought everything the 40k universe has to offer, their early years being remarkable for the amount of times they found themselves clashing with the Eldar. And the chapter's name is a reference to how the original chapter master used to fight. For Alexei Polu always fought with a power fist, a heavy blunt weapon he could swing with the grace and efficiency of most swordsmen. A weapon that would always be caked in the gore of his enemies by the time he was done. Thus the name the Crimson Fists. Many Crimson Fist officers continue to carry power fists to this day, painted red, all to honor the long-lost hero that founded this chapter. Buckle up, boys, this is going to be a long one. The first major military campaign of the Crimson Fists was the liberation of Uralek Prime, an Imperial colony invaded by Eldar Exodites, the rough Eldar equivalent of Wood Elves in 40k. The Exodites hit the colony's defenders with rapid cavalry strikes, moving with a speed no unaugmented human could hope to keep up with. Alexis Polu himself led the drop strikes on the Eldar, countering their speed with stalwart defensiveness. A Devastator squad and all of the chapter's tanks were deployed and eventually defeated the Exodite forces. Ironically, the next major military campaign the Crimson Fists participated in was the War of the Beast, unifying the second founding successor chapters back under the badge of the original Legion. This included the Excoriators, the Black Templars, and the Iron Knights as well. After the death of Courland, the last proper Imperial Fist, some of the veteran members of those chapters all stayed behind to rebuild, returning to the chapter that once unified them all. Following the War of the Beast, the Crimson Fists returned to crusading, although instead of fighting the enemies of mankind, they found themselves facing other humans in combat, as this happened to be the Age of Apostasy. At the risk of bloating this video even longer than it's already going to be, I'll just state that the High Ecclesiarch at the time basically went insane and almost destroyed the Imperium. This led to both the birth of the Sisters of Battle and the Ordo Hereticus of the Inquisition. The Crimson Fists reconquered 84 worlds and settled on their first homeworld of Rens World. And for those of you who don't know, Rens World is on the border between Orc and Imperium space, meaning the Crimson Fists would have their red-painted hands full on this planet. In my opinion, not much of a reward for reconquering almost 100 planets after a civil war, but they're Space Marines, they kinda live for this stuff. And get used to hearing, and then the Crimson Fists fought Orcs again, because that's going to happen a lot over the course of this video. At least they're not the super smart Orcs recreating Space Marines again. Man, the War of the Beast was the weirdest saga in 40k that deserves its own video. Alright, so after getting their own planet, the next thing they did was lay the beat down on Craftworld Eandon. They invaded a world called Thule and basically told the planetary governor they had to surrender or they were going to kill everyone. So the Crimson Fists appeared and told them no, and then made them run away. Somebody call Pancreas No Work and tell him to come pick up his boys because they got their asses kicked. This, of course, kicking off another rivalry for the Crimson Fists, because having orcs constantly kicking down your back door isn't bad enough. So in case it wasn't obvious to you, the Crimson Fists were one of the most active chapters of Space Marines in the 10,000 years after the Horus Heresy, meaning they did not have a lot of time to rebuild from their losses. Before they fought the Eldar on Thule, there were only 128 Crimson Fists left. Their forces almost completely depleted during their 300-year crusade. It is because this close brush with extinction that the first company of the Crimson Fists always maintains a number of 128 to honor those legendary veterans of yesteryear. The Crimson Fists do not like going to war while that first company is understaffed, viewing it as a bad omen. It should also be noted that the Crimson Fists do not exactly have a lot of allies among other Astartes chapters. They once even almost quote-unquote came to blows with the Mortifactor successor chapter of the Ultramarines. Were it not for the intervention of Marneus Calgar, it's possible one or both chapters could have been viewed as traitors by the High Lords of Terra. I really wish I could elaborate on this moment further, but I really can't. I can't find any information to flesh this out. What the hell the Mortifactors and Crimson Fists would be doing at the same place is just beyond me. And why were the Ultramarines there? I don't know, but I'm sure glad they were. The point of all of this is to establish the fact that the Crimson Fists are a stubborn lot, and they lack a lot of the decorum of the proper Imperial Fist chapter. They aren't quite on the same level of surly as the Excoriators or the Black Templar are, but their main strength is in crushing orcs and Eldar, not dealing with their cousins or brothers. Unless, of course, it's purging said cousins or brothers who happen to have fallen to chaos. Because before the modern Minotaurs existed, the Crimson Fists were usually the guys the Ministorum called on to do so. After the Battle of the Steel Cross, where the chapter fought orcs, and the Battle of Hellebore, where the Crimson Fists fought Craftworld Eandon again, they were issued their first mission to hunt down renegade Astartes, a Chaos warband that called itself the Purge. The Purge are a Chaos warband of Nurgle, descendant from the Death Guard. They just happen to have invaded a very important world in the Imperium, the fortress world of Axhalia, an astropath hub, and one of the most important planets in the Heracles sector. So on this mission, the Crimson Fists fought alongside the Hammers of Dorn, the Fire Lords, Cadian shock troops, Knights of House Raven, just for the Inquisition to recognize the planet as corrupt beyond use from this point on and declared exterminatus. Meaning this epic battle featuring all of these military organizations was completely pointless, which is just par for the course in this setting. And somewhere in this mess of a timeline are 3 more examples of the Crimson Fists being tasked with hunting down other renegade chapters. The first was the Sons of Gideon, a chapter I can pretty much tell you nothing about other than they were destroyed by the Crimson Fists after falling to chaos. The second chapter they successfully destroyed was the Marines Vigilant, who just one day decided they didn't want to fight anymore. They didn't even fight in their own defense when the Crimson Fists came for them. They just accepted their deaths with honor. Lastly, the Crimson Fists were tasked with hunting down their brother chapter, the Soul Drinkers, an alleged successor chapter of the Imperial Fists dating back to the second founding. This is something even the Soul Drinkers themselves came to question, finding that their gene seed had nothing in common with other successors of the Imperial Fist Legion. Their strange mutations and affinity for the Chaos God Tzeentch implying that they might have been loyalist Thousand Sons at one point. There is a new Primaris chapter for Soul Drinkers, but they're completely different. The Soul Drinkers did manage to escape, however, redeeming themselves in the Battle of the Phalanx, sacrificing what remained of the tainted chapter to save the Imperial Fists, and their legendary Fortress Monastery. So the whole debacle with the Sons of Gideon really wasn't a big deal. That chapter had proven themselves to be traitors, they fell to chaos, yada yada yada. It was the situation with the Marines Vigilant that left a bad taste in a lot of other chapters' mouths. Even their brothers, the Black Templars, started calling the Crimson Fists Ministorum dogs after that. Purging traitors is one thing. Purging a chapter that's clearly having some kind of crisis of faith or conscience is a completely different ballgame. And it sort of marked the Crimson Fists as pariahs for a little bit. Alright, the last thing I want to talk about before we get to the Battle of Rens World is the Deac Crusade, While I can't say for sure where this happened in the timeline, I'd like to believe this happened in order to restore relations between the Black Templars and Crimson Fists. The two chapters were sent out in mixed squads. As a sign of unity, they exchanged chapter iconography, the Black Templars painting their left hands red, and the Crimson Fists painting a Black Templar cross on their right knees. Because nothing can bring some estranged brothers back together than fighting orcs. Just another reason to love the green psychopaths. Ultimately, this crusade was successful, because nothing can stand against the combined stubbornness of two chapters of Imperial Fist successors. And on a personal level, I'd like to think after the combat was over, the two chapters took a little break. Played a good game of family football or soccer or something amongst the corpses of all the orcs they'd torn apart, while their respective chapter serfs used flamethrowers to make sure the little fungus boys didn't grow back. This is by far the most difficult portion of this video to talk about. The battle for Rens World was such a big event for the Crimson Fists. It was such a big part of defining their chapter master, Pedro Cantor, that I am genuinely finding it difficult to do this battle justice. It started off with the invasion of the Agra world of Bad Landing. The third company of the Crimson Fists were sent to gather intel on the enemy, and if possible, delay their arrival on Rens World for as long as possible. The Orc Empire Caradon, led by Snagrod, is one of the largest and most organized empires of the entire species, and his invasion of Rens World is often compared to the Third War for Armageddon in terms of sheer size of the Orc War. So one company of Space Marines that wasn't even up to full strength was not going to buy much time. Nearly half of the third company died gathering the intel, and not much time was bought for the defenders of Rens World. But at least the chapter and the other defenders of the planet had an idea of what they were up against. The Crimson Fists got their surface-to-air missile system set up and were ready to fend off the attackers. They were also able to get a distress signal out to let the rest of the Imperium know they were in trouble. Rens World is a feudal agricultural world, and as far as I can tell, does not have its own House of Knights or any standing force of guardsmen. Their almost sole defenders are the Crimson Fist and a token force of planetary defenders, which seems a bit underprepared for a planet so close to orc space, but what do I know? Despite the relatively small force of defenders on Rens World, initially the battle was going pretty well for the Imperials. The missile defense system set up by the Crimson Fists was holding the orc ships at bay, at least until it malfunctioned and accidentally targeted the Crimson Fists' monastery. That's right, the Crimson Fists' defensive weapons accidentally blew up most of the chapter. 16 Crimson Fists survived the impact of the plasma missile. 16. There were Crimson Fists on other parts of the planet protecting civilians, but they took heavy losses from a malfunction before a single orc stepped foot on the planet. That is bad luck on par with the Lamenters. The surviving members of the chapter gathered a new Rens city to defend it, and the sole spaceport in the entire planet. The Crimson Fists held the line for 18 months against one of the largest orc wars seen in this century. 18 months. It took reinforcements from 6 other chapters of Space Marines to break Snagrod's Wa, leaving the Crimson Fists at 40% of their strength, and the planet so decimated it was almost impossible to recruit new initiates, meaning that even after the Wa was broken, the Crimson Fists would be fighting orcs on the planet for years to come, at diminished strength, while still having to send out some of their companies to fight off-world. And everybody wonders why this particular chapter is so bitter. Alright, so on paper, the battle for Rens World was over and the Imperials won. They lost most of the Loki sector and still have not reclaimed any of the planets they lost to the Orc War, but on paper, the battle for Rens World was a success. But the Crimson Fists had a lot of cleaning up to do. And the most notable battle of the rebuilding of Rens World was the Battle of Traitor's Gorge. While the few remaining tech marines of the Crimson Fists did their best to rebuild the fortress, Chapter Master Pedro Cantor personally led 24 of his finest space marines into the Jaded Mountains, hunting down whatever orcs they could find, finding them behind literally every rock and inside every crevice of the mountains. And of course, word spread throughout the orcs that a good fight was coming their way. So after just a few days of hunting, 24 space marines were surrounded by another horde of orcs. A horde of orcs that was also in the process of constructing gargants. It was said that they literally filled Trader's Gorge with the body and blood of dead orcs. And then some very unlikely help arrived for the Crimson Fist. A bunch of ethereal, spectral warriors showed up and started fighting the orcs as well, destroying their leaders and scattering the war bands. And no, it's not what you're thinking. This wasn't the Legion of the Damned coming to save noble heroes of the Imperium. It was the Eldar. Apparently a bunch of Eldar Farseers saw that if Rens' world fell to the orcs, they would be in trouble. So a small band of Eldar fighters came to bail out the Crimson Fists. And oddly enough, Pedro Cantor asked if this meant they were allies now. He was the one extending the olive branch of friendship long before Guilliman came back. Well, not super long before he came back, but you get what I'm saying. The Eldar said no, acted all vague and mystic like they always do, and then disappeared back to wherever they came from, leaving Pedro Cantor and his men to finish off the last of the orcs and continue rebuilding their chapter. Alright, so during the time of the 13th Black Crusade, the Crimson Fists were busy fighting the Tau. Their third sphere of expansion was spreading into the Damocles Gulf again, taking advantage of the chaos around the Eye of Terror and the invasion of Hive Fleet Leviathan in other parts of the galaxy, led by the Tau's legendary commander Shadow Sun. Given the state that the Crimson Fist chapter was in, they really didn't play a big role in this offensive. Kaido Sicarius of the Ultramarines led the charge, so really, the whole campaign was all about them. And way too many chapters were involved in the Zeiss campaign for me to put pictures up of all of them. I am only one man and I am trying to get this video done before November. Please take mercy on me. Oh, and then demons invaded Rens' world, because the Crimson Fists just cannot catch a break. This invasion force was led by a demon prince named Raxor, which means no matter how badass and stubborn the Crimson Fists can be, there's no way they were going to win this fight. And yet, they stood their ground and prepared to die with honor. And then the winged Hussars arrived. I'm just kidding, Guilliman showed up and gave them Primaris reinforcements, basically restoring the chapter back to full strength. Guilliman also gave Pedro Cantor a pep talk he's needed for a while, letting him know how good of a job he was doing and how proud Rogel Dorn would be if he could see him. Which also just happened to be a little bit of a dig at his brother Helberect leading the Black Templars. But I mean, we all know how the Emperor was like. Being petty is just in their DNA. And that, my friends, is a very abridged version of the story of the Crimson Fist. I'm really hoping I can make a part 2 to this video. If I can track down a physical copy of the Crimson Fist Omnibus, I'd really be able to flesh out some of the areas I struggled with making this video. There's only so much you can do with codexes and wiki pages. When you have that greater level of fluff and crunch from an actual book to dig into, there's just so much more to work with. My next video is going to be about the Siege of the Citadel on Hydra Cordatus, one of the greatest victories of the Iron Warriors over the Imperial Fists, and the first novel featuring the character Hanzo created by Graham McNeil. I'd like to thank you all for giving this video a watch, and have a good day.